Jonas Blackwell stood on his porch at dawn. The brass face of his pocket watch lay open in his palm, a small warm weight against knuckles that had forgotten how to be steady. The February wind off the valley cut across Montana like a blade, but he barely felt the cold. His breath marked the air in quick, white puffs that vanished as soon as they came. The stagecoach was late. For 3 years he'd learned to keep his face flat, to answer mornings with the same measured nod, to let the life of the town roll over him like dust. He had walked each day with a dozen apologies folded into his steps, none of them spoken. This morning, when the coach might bring one of the men he'd wronged, or a witness, or simply the mail, something in his chest moved as if in reply. Today might change everything. Across from him, where the telegraph station sat like a watchful sparrow on the edge of Maine, a woman bent over the table, fingers steady as she read a strip of paper. Maeve O'Rourke had always made the office look smaller than it was. A strong back beneath a wool coat, hair pinned back in a way that kept the line of her neck clear. She was 36, with the look of someone who had learned the language of survival softened here and there by a laugh that reached her eyes. The town remembered her as a telegraph operator, a keeper of messages, a woman who could send far-off words into the dark and make them make sense. What the town did not remember well was the way she moved when she thought no one watched, like a reed in a current. Deliberate, small and precise and entirely hers. Jonas had watched her often. From afar at church when the organ sounded too loud and he couldn't find a prayer that fit. From the Marshal station when a hand on the rail needed a steadying. From the porches where town elders leaned upon their canes and spoke of law and debt. He thought he knew the rhythm of her life. He knew the cadence of the code she tapped out, dash, pause, and had learned to read the slightest tension in her shoulders when a cipher didn't add right. He had not known how much of him kept waiting for her to look up, to find him in the way some people find the horizon. There had been a winter 3 years past when he had done a thing he could not yet forgive himself for. He had been a younger Marshal, quicker with the theory of law than the pity. There had been threats under the table ledgers that mapped out his obligations, names that nodded in hushes toward vaults and pastures, and the kind of money that could buy silence. Hargreave wanted the rail to go through his land, and was willing to grease any hand that would steer it. The ledger Maeve had tapped with her key, the one she had tucked into a letter, had exposed something that could not be allowed. It spoke of men who moved cattle like coin and of a scheme to brand lawmen as fools. Maeve had warned an outlaw, Ly Mercer, and for that she had paid a price. "You don't have to," she'd told Eli in the station once, voice low as the hum of the key. "Run when you can." He hadn't vanished. Eli had used the warning as counterweight, exposing Hargreave's reach to those who would listen. For it, Eli became wanted, and Maeve found herself a dangerous ledger away from safety. Jonas had made a choice then, a rotten necessary choice he had told himself, and the town had watched the telegraph fall silent for a while. He had arranged a transfer. A man with a ledger was a liability. He had brokered a removal, Maeve taken under a claim of debt to serve at a distant ranch. Her departure papered over with signatures and stamps that glinted like a threat. Some in the town would whisper it as being sold, a word that clung like tar. Jonas had told himself he had kept her from being killed, that the arrangement guaranteed her life in exchange for the ledger's quiet. He had thought that if she were far and fed, the ledger would be forgotten. He had thought less of what gave him right to decide for her. She'd come back 3 years later with the same hands that tapped, but with a new set to them, calluses in unexpected places, a steadiness born of having had to hold her own. She had returned because telegraph work was what she did, and because silence had never sat right in her mouth, and because the ledger had not been forgotten. Hargreave's men still hunted the edges of their plans, and the town had a way of rotating blame toward the weak. Jonas felt the old ache like an animal pressing against a cave mouth. The stagecoach ground at last down Maine and kicked up a flurry of grit. A postman climbed down and carried a mailbag like an offered armful. There were familiar faces and strangers, but his eyes caught Maeve's as the mail changed hands. She looked at him, bare and full of a history he had been part of and had refused to mend. For an instant, the world reduced to their breathing, and he nearly betrayed the measure he had been keeping. He straightened, pocket watch returned to its place, and moved forward with the careful gait of a man who had practiced contrition in private. Act 1. Awareness begins. Maeve's office smelled of iron and oil and paper, the scent of wires and small, heated mechanisms. The first time Jonas had returned as Marshal after what had been called the Hargreave affair. She had watched him stand across the street like a man learning an old song. She had been younger then, less careful with the aversion she let slip into the curl of her lip. When she had left, she'd imagined there would be a finality to her leaving, a line cut like seam. When she had come back, the line had been frayed, tied into knots the world had called necessity. She kept her work dignified as one keeps a song when grief is trying to take it. Fingers hovered above the key, and she read the latest strip of tape with a sorcerous calm. There were messages lit with business and dull with gossip. There were the coded bursts that signaled something colder. It was in one of those small pauses when she was supposed to be nothing but a conduit that Eli Mercer's name had come, and then a threat, a price on the man he held in the town's low regard. The code didn't lie. The ledger still mattered. She had warned Eli because it was her job, and because some other part of her annulled. Fierce stubbornness would not let the ledger sit like a smoldering ember. She had done it in a way that felt like throwing a stone into deep water, making the ripple, trusting distance would scatter heat. Jonas had answered for her with a coldness she had never seen before, arranging her removal, as if it were a ledger to be balanced. Now he stood across from her again, and she tried not to let the light in her hand tremble. She let him pass a note through the door, a message from the Marshal's office that required her signature. Their hands brushed across the paper. His fingers were warm, calloused, the slight tremor of weather-edged roughness catching her skin like a question. His scent, a mix of leather and man, of saddle sweat and soap, caught at the back of her throat. She tried not to notice that his jaw looked like it took work to keep unbroken. She tried not to notice the way he watched the twitch of her fingers as if the motion could map the person she had become. She tried not to think of the 3 winters that had been neither his nor wholly hers. Yet her body learned to catalog things regardless of will. The slope of his shoulders under that coat, the thickness of the lines at the corners of his eyes, the way his breath caught when she lifted her chin to meet his stare. Her pulse was, for a moment, visible at her throat. She cataloged them like a map, in case she needed a route for escape, and in case she needed a road home. Jonas stood at the counter, the Marshal's badge catching the morning and throwing it back as a softened star. His voice, when he spoke, was the low sound of winter timber. "There was a rider out past Hargreaves this morning," he said. "Tracks like a man someone forgot to put a price on." Maeve listened. Her fingers came to rest on the heavy brass of the sounder. The town might speak of her as a conduit, but in her chest there was a hunger to be seen as more than a line between points. She had watched Jonas weigh men like produce for too long before she left. She had felt the ledger's heat hot enough to burn. Now she watched him with the same clarity she read telegrams. One through line, another between. "You should be at the office," she answered, the syntax of command tempered by habit. "People have questions." "I am," he said, and the word contained a tide of things. The man who kept order and the man who remembered failing. "I came to ask if you'd seen Eli. He rode through here 3 years ago when there was trouble." "If he's back ... double quotes." Her hands tightened against the sounder, not from anger, but from the old, practiced control. "He's wanted," she said. "I warned him." The words were blunt. They had always been blunt. Maeve had the economical manner of someone who had learned that too many sentences could be dangerous. Jonas's mouth flattened. "You nearly lost yourself to that ledger," he said, and without thinking, he reached and covered her hand with his own. The touch lasted a second and felt like a confession. Every muscle in him seemed to hold the shape of restraint. His fingers were large where hers were small, his palm rough from reins and rope and the daily bluntness of his work. His calloused fingers brushed hers as he covered her hand, and the contact was electric in its smallness. "I thought," he stopped, swallowing whatever defense had been building. Maeve felt the warmth radiating from his body like a heat against the winter. Her breath caught when he stepped closer. She became aware of the charged air between them. She didn't move to pull away. That, perhaps, was the first small relinquishment, a concession that the town could not erase a history of care with simple measures. She felt the quickness of her pulse, as if the telegraph in her chest had taken to tapping out a new code she hadn't yet learned. They let go as if by mutual decision, and the room folded into an ordinary morning. He left with the mailbag at his hip, and she went back to the sounder, her wrists composed, her mind cluttered with miniature betrayals and unlikely mercies. They went their separate ways across the day, Jonas to the Marshal's rotunda and paperwork, Maeve to tapping and listening to the strings that made the frontier small. Each noticed the other in mundane acts, how Jonas adjusted the brim of his hat, the way he exhaled when a burden eased, how Maeve tied the ends of her hair with a cracked ribbon. Proximity became a kind of pressure, a barometer of things unsaid. The telegraph hummed like a contained river, and in its music. The two of them found themselves close enough to be dangerous. At sunset, when the inn had a fire and the town gathered with a habit of saying nothing about the things that hurt, Jonas and Maeve sat at opposite ends of a table. The innkeeper put down a bowl between them. It steamed, heavy with beef and root vegetables. The light made Maeve look younger. The bowl made Jonas feel both a father and a child. There was a soft, careful civility than two people who could still exist in the same room without collapsing the past into the present. And yet their glances kept meeting across the steam. And when they did, they held longer than the comfortable space of acquaintances. It was an accidental touch, a passing of the bread at the table, that threaded their fingers for the breath of an instant. Maeve felt a shock go up her arm, like a weather shift. Jonas's hand lingered a beat longer than necessary, his thumb sketching by habit across the back of her hand, as if smoothing a crease in something delicate. He kept his voice low. "You have to be cautious," he said, not as judge but as warning. "They'll come if the ledger is spoken of loud enough." "I know who will come," she said. Heat pooled low in her belly at the concern in his voice. "And I didn't warn Eli because I liked the idea of being in danger." Her eyes flicked to his and held. "I warned him because someone had to say the truth, that the man who had arranged the ledger's disappearance had now come to tell her to be cautious." Felt like a slap softened by a hand. She didn't tell him that her caution was a craft she had honed, or that there were nights she dreamed of folding herself up into a small, impenetrable thing. She only said, "Watch the road." And the words were simpler than the palms against which they landed. Both of them noticed, too, that the town had begun to lean one way or another. There were whispers that rode the wind and found purchase in the cracks of buildings. Hargreaves' name threaded with Jonas's in ways the town assumed would remain private until the ledger burned. Jonas felt each whisper as a small stone thrown at a window. He had learned how to set his jaw against the gusts. Maeve learned to walk through them with the steadiness of someone who had been pushed and discovered she did not break. When the inn's light began to gutter and the town thinned, he walked her to the telegraph station. They stood in the haloed doorway, a space too narrow for the histories they carried. Jonas's coat flared slightly with the motion of his arm. Maeve's hair had slipped from its pins. A strand lay along the slope of her cheek like a question mark. "Stay," Jonas said, the word small and a neighbor's facet of command. She considered him, her mouth lifted in a half-smile, not quite reaching her eyes. "You act like I'm a child. I act like I'm a man who's owed a lot," he said, and something like shame passed through the line of his shoulders. "I don't know if that's any better." He held the door for her. Their fingers touched again, this time more deliberately as she crossed his threshold into the body of the town's night. Close enough to feel his heartbeat through the fabric. The contact was almost the kind that draws a breath short and leaves a wish in its wake. They parted with a civility that kept them safe, and the night swallowed the thin, bright sound of the telegraph key somewhere inside the station. Act 2. Proximity creates tension. Winter deepened, and with it the small domestic choreography of a town that had decided to keep breathing. The telegraph kept working, and with it, Maeve. There was ritual in the way she wound the coil on the sounder, in the way she brushed soot from the stove or she boiled water for coffee. The town took comfort in those rituals. Jonas, in the pockets of his coat, found a new ritual, leaving a bundle of wood at the telegraph door, the knots tied with the certainty of a man who cleaned his conscience with action. Proximity bred the gentlest of violences. Their lives began to touch with the mundane. He would come in to file a report, and watch her sleeves roll up at the elbow, the pale skin turned to the task of cleaning a lens, the tendons bright at her wrist. He would be on the porch in the mornings until she came out, shivering but steady, and he would bring his presence like a slow heat. She watched him drag that heat with an almost academic curiosity, cataloging anxiety as if mapping the sky. There was a particular morning, the kind of day where breath frosted the air and the world seemed cut from glass, when the stagecoach disgorged a man who smelled of horse sweat and trouble. Eli Mercer stepped off the coach like someone who had been sobered by ride and intent. He carried a pack, notched and old, and eyes like storm clouds that had held an image of injustice and refused to give it up. When she saw him, something unclenched inside Maeve. Eli was not handsome in the way of soft men. His face was made of angles and stories, his jaw a cliff. He had been the man she'd warned 3 years earlier, the one who'd taken what she said and used it like a lantern. He walked into town as if he expected the ground to be rough. He didn't look surprised by the roughness. Jonas watched him too, his jaw set again, knuckles whitening for a breath. He had known Eli by the sort of distance that names assign you in court and ledger. He had also known the man who never asked forgiveness when he didn't get it, who only settled scores the way storms rearrange stones. For Maeve, Eli's presence was a complicated thing, relief and fear braided together. For Jonas, Eli's return was like a hand opening a wound. Over the next days, the town became an exercise in forced closeness. There was the drawer that needed mending at the Marshal's office. Jonas needed Maeve's steady hands to reline a sounder. At the inn, they chopped vegetables and their shoulders touched in the cramped doorway. Their accidental touches grew into moments that seemed choreographed by some mischievous god. A hand would brush hair at the nape of Maeve's neck. A sleeve would bump a forearm. Plates slid across the same table. They were seeking reasons to be near the other without purporting to desire more. Jonas found himself inventing reasons. He made reports that needed transmitting. He had to check telegraph lines when the cold made them sing. Maeve found herself answering in kind repairs to a torn sleeve, a pot of soup left on his stoop when he'd likely forget to take a proper meal. The town watched with a bit of yard dog hunger, keen to see if two people with such tangled pasts could become a story they liked. But most were wary. The ledger's shadow still lay like an old map between them. The first deliberate touch came on one of those long afternoons, when wind pushed at the windows and the telegraph office felt like the only warm thing within 10 miles. Maeve had been working on a wire splice in the corner, her fingers coaxed into small skilled motions. Jonas had come in to tell her of a patrol he planned, and in the delivery of a sentence he found the phrase wrong and stopped. He crouched down at her level to look at the splice. "You should not have done it like that," he said. The sentence was a standard. He didn't mean to be kind. He also did. Her hand brushed his as she handed him an insulated wire. The contact lingered. He could feel each seam in his palm, as if the world had been reduced to a single dangerous detail. He straightened and found his breath quickening. "Let me see," he said. His hands smelled of leather and sun. He moved with the efficiency of a man who had spent a life measuring the space between force and tenderness. He took the wire between his fingers and their palms met. In the slight press, Maeve felt the history of that other winter of being moved like an object, of hands that had closed a gate she hadn't chosen. She waited for the old hurt to bloom. Instead, Jonas's touch was gentle, as if apologizing in small, expensive things. He tied the splice and then, without a word, nudged a stray curl behind her ear. His calloused thumb brushed the skin at her temple. The gesture was full of a tenderness that had the weight of penance. They sat close by the stove in that office, breath warm enough that the ash on the hearth loosened. The conversation around the ledger flared and subsided like wind. Hargreaves' name appeared in dispatches Marcus had, in more than one gathering, tried to keep out of public air. This brought protective gestures from Jonas. At a town meeting, he stood between a man looking to start trouble and Maeve as if physical presence could alter pain. He took the blows destined for her silence and moved them elsewhere. It was quiet heroism, not the sort that demanded applause. Maeve watched, and the watching began to fold into something like wanting. It was the kind of wanting that did not extinguish memory, but layered it. The knowledge that he had the power to hurt her, and could have chosen instead to be brave. He'd been cowardice and rescue in the same life. She kept a ledger for each, neat and separate. When he wrapped a blanket around her shoulders after a cart accident left her chilled, his hands lingered at her collarbone, feeling the delicate line of bone. He didn't say anything. Let the silence be the permission he was not yet ready to give in words. The long look they gave one another was a confessional. Eli watched them with a kind of private amusement that made Maeve think of storms. He had a way of seeing into people as if seeing was the first step toward remaking them. He pulled a chair up to the telegraph one evening and tapped his knuckles at rhythm with the sounder. "You two," he said, eyes on both of them. "You wear your past like a second coat. It's warm, but it gets in the way." Jonas's hand twitched at that. "You don't know what you're speaking for," he said. "I know what people do when they're given power and keep it," Eli said. "I also know what people do when they're given the chance to give it back." He smiled, crooked and honest. "Sometimes they make more of the town. Sometimes they make a life." Maeve felt something in her chest shift. It was a reveal that was not thunderous but necessary. She had been thinking of power as the thing used to control her. She had not thought of it as something that could be returned, tenderly, and with a weight she had not known to desire. The very idea of Jonas giving back what he had taken apology, if not amends, stirred an odd warmth that was no longer purely anger. She wanted to be desired. She also wanted to choose being desired. The idea that either could happen without the ledger's business at the center made her heart spool in new directions. And then there were the almost kisses. Those moments when a question hangs in the air like cold fog and is close enough to touch but not quite there. Jonas would lean in to tell her something practical about line maintenance or to ask a simple question about letters. And the air between them would tighten in a way that felt like gravity. He would inhale close enough that she could feel his breath across the line of her cheek, and she would catch herself, small and bright with wanting. In those suspended breaths, the town fell away. In the next instant, someone's boot would creak in the hall, or a telegram would clatter in with news that demanded a practical answer, and the moment would break like thin glass. Maeve found herself seeking his gaze in those moments. She watched how he worked, how his fingers moved, how he breathed when he didn't think he was being seen. She began shyly to let her hair down when they were alone, a literal and symbolic relaxing of the defenses she'd built. When she unpinned the hair and it came loose like a soft curtain, Jonas would glance at it as if seeing something he had missed for years. His eyes darkened watching her. He would look away quickly, working himself into a shape of composure. The town's whispers grew sharper. Someone had said something about Jonas's past dealings with Hargreave, and the accusation, like mold, began to spread. For Maeve, every rumor was a reminder of how small one could feel in the face of barons and ledgers. For Jonas, every rumor felt like a pebble landing against the hull of his life. He took to sleeping with the window open, to the smell of cold and wood smoke like a companion. When Hargreave's men came by the station to ask for signatures, to query ownership of certain parcels, Jonas let himself answer, bare and honest. In public, where a man must be seen straight, he began to unbutton. In private, in the small light of the Telegraph, he found himself learning to choose touch. The first time Jonas let his hands touch Maeve's face in a way that wasn't hurried, it was after they'd been threatened. Hargreave's enforcer Tull, a man whose hands looked like they had been made to break things, had come into the Telegraph office with swagger. He had demanded the ledger. He had sneered. Maeve had stood like something composed of rope and patience. She had refused. He had slapped the ledger off the table and promised retribution. Jonas had moved as men in his office did, stepping across a line to make a stand. The enforcer had told him he was a fool, and left with a kind of boredom in his stride. After the enforcer's boots had faded into the street, Maeve sat at the desk and let the tremor take her. Jonas came close and cupped her jaw with both hands, thumb sweeping away a fleck of soot. His calloused thumb traced her jaw, rough against soft. The gesture was fatherly and loverly in the way that tears sometimes are contradictory and absolute. His hands were everywhere in that moment, on the curl of her hair, at the column of her throat, at her wrist where a vein ran like a small river. There was a hush that settled over both of them, and he leaned forward as if to offer something else, an apology perhaps, or an explanation written in breath. She felt his warmth and thought of the winters past, of being moved in a way she had not chosen, and could have drawn back to righteous anger. Instead, she let herself be held. The feeling was complicated, tenderness braided through pain, but it was also, to her surprise, reclamation. Here was a hand that could have been used as a fetter and was now, finally, a kindness. Her fingers found the back of his coat, tracing the line of his scapula as if testing that he was real. The almost kiss hung like a promise. Their mouths came close enough that she could taste the clean tang of coal. He paused, breathing, and 1,000 possible words died in the doorway of his throat. "Don't," she whispered, which was as much warning as invitation. "Don't what?" He breathed back, not keeping his voice steady. "Don't pretend it can be fixed with a touch," she said. "Say it." He swallowed. The confession that followed was not dramatic. It was a soft unwinding. He had been blackmailed, led by a ledger and a panic that made him small. He had made choices in fear that cost her. He had kept the ledger's secrecy out of a mistaken tenderness. He had been wrong. The admission made his jaw clench, the muscles working to hold back the rest. The sentence broke something like dawn inside her. Forgiveness, she had learned, was not a currency often spent, but neither had she the disinclination to hold on to a weight that offered no future. Jonas's hands on her throat, his mouth near hers, his eyes lit with a willingness to be better. These were not absolution, but they were a beginning. The first deliberate touch, the one she did not pull away from, was a risk she took because she wanted to be wanted by her terms. It was, in its own way, her small triumph. They almost kissed then, lips barely brushing, the heat between them rising like a hearth that had been banked too long. At the very edge, a shout came from beyond the office. Someone calling the town into a meeting, and the moment snapped. They straightened, pretending the exchange had been nothing but a comic misstep, and parted with the practiced civility of two people learning to hold more than a grudge in their hands. Act 3. Tension breaks and rebuilds. The ledger did not like to be forgotten. Men whose names were scrawled in it had allies, and those allies had memory like a thing that grows with neglect. Hargreave, a man with acres enough to make a map of greed, sent men to retrieve what the ledger made visible. The town, which liked to think of itself as a place of slow justice, became a pressure cooker, rumors serving as steam. Jonas had tried for 3 years to mop up the evidence of his missteps with small axewood at the door, a presence at the station, but the ledger remained, a weight the size of a man's conscience. The night the trouble came, it arrived not as thunder but as a slow, ruthless sort of weather. Hargreave's men came in with ropes and a vocabulary of entitlement. They cut telegraph lines to keep messages from going out. They wrecked the office as if it were a body to humiliate. They left a threat carved into the wood. The town stood in the cold and watched them do it, too afraid of Baron and posse to stand and call for justice. Maeve found herself staring at the splintered casing of the sounder like a thing that had been violated. Fingers wrapped around the wood and felt the bite of edges. She wanted to go on and make the machine work, to tie knots of wire until the hum returned. Instead, she sat in the dark and let her ribs hold their own pity. Jonas reacted the way men who love and fear tend to, with a rough, immediate protectiveness. He stepped in between Hargreave's men and the station as if his body alone could be a line of law. He barked names and writs, and the town's code like raindrops at a bullet. It did not stop them. It did make his anger agonizingly visible. What broke them, though, was the knowledge that Hargreave's men had not come for mere mischief. Among the wreckage of the office, they had left a ledger, one that was not the ledger, but a ledger's shadow, pages of names and places and a hint of their operations. It was an ugly way to bait a fight. The town buzzed with a rumor that kept moving like a slow fever. The sheriff in a neighboring town might be persuaded to remove the marshal for complicity if enough people signed an affidavit. Jonas was a man who could be removed for his past, and here it was, given neatly like a gift. Maeve's first reaction was not to the ledger, but to the way Jonas looked at the town, as if he were seeing the place as a creature might see its own bones. The anger in him had the tenderness of a man who had, for a long time, been holding his breath. He began to pull away. He closed himself in the marshal's office, avoiding the inn, avoiding the telegraph. Maeve felt the hurt of that retreat like frost. She, too, pulled back. It hurt to see him close up with the idea that he might be removed from power, and it hurt more to remember that he'd been the one to plan her removal years ago. She felt both wounds in her mouth and kept words from splintering like wood in winter. What she felt physically also began to ache. Nights were restless. She woke from dreams of being on a stage and sold as if she were produced banded for bartering. These images became a kind of phantom pain for which there was no salve. Eli watched the town's fracture like a man who had always had a view on truth. He was the one who had pushed Hargreave's ledger into the sun, who had pulled names from shadows and made them visible. He had also, behind the scenes, ensured that evidence would travel to authorities in places that mattered. He had an impatience for slow justice, but he did not relish unnecessary cruelty. He pried into the town's seams to find what had been sown poorly. Maeve realized then that her warning to Eli had been more than a tremor in the water. It had been a pebble that started a cascade. In her mind, the ledger was no longer a thing to be silenced. It was a thing that had a life beyond its pages. It belonged, if anything, on the laps of men who could do good with it, not in the grubby palms of tyrants. The separation between Jonas and Maeve widened. Each of them had to test their truth in the dark. Each of them had rooms where they shelved the other like a book they weren't yet ready to read. For Jonas, the crime was not only political, it was personal. He had made a choice that hurt a woman he had come to care for. He now saw the ledger as the seat of his cowardice. Yet he also had a stubbornness that told him the town needed him, and that being thrown from the post could lead Hargreave to the final victory he had sought. The dark night of the Soul chapter came in small acts of absence. Maeve walked the plane at night and listened to the wire sing a lonely song. Jonas, in the marshal's office, stared at his own hands and the tiny scrape on his thumb from the sounder. Both of them were contacted by the past. The ledger haunted Maeve. In dreams it filled rooms, folded like a map you could not read. Jonas dreamed of the ledger for a different reason. It was the record of where he had failed. They both understood, finally, that what had begun as desire had turned into something more durable, a need for honesty, for the kind of touch that did not bruise. Jonas decided he could not simply apologize in the tidy currency of plates of roast beef and a bundle of firewood. He thought of Hargreaves' hold on the county and of what it would cost to make restitution. He thought of Eli, who had nothing to gain by exposing the ledger and had done so anyway. Jonas understood that staying on as Marshal and publicly owning his mistake, allowing himself to be judged and potentially removed, might be the only honest penance he could offer. Honesty, he suspected, might be the only invitation that carried force enough to break Maeve's armor. So he made a choice. He walked into the town square and offered his resignation publicly, and then turned the ledger story over to the county judge with whatever evidence Eli and others had compiled. It was a clumsy, brave move, the kind of thing that still had the edge of wood smoke. It saved some things and exposed others. Hargreave, momentarily dislodged, moved like an animal who hadn't expected to be observed. Jonas's act did not end the Baron's influence, but it forced a rearrangement, and it made the ledger's voice audible in the ears of men with the power to act. When Jonas confessed everything to Maeve, it was in the telegraph office, with the light low and the sounder humming an almost lullaby beneath their words. He told her the truth, every misdeed, every frightened calculation, the small betrayals not born of malice alone, but of the horrifying human tendency to choose less pain for oneself in the short term and pay more later. He told her of the blackmail, of how the names in the ledger had been leverage around his throat. He told her he had been bought and had bought silence. He asked for nothing but the right to be honest. Maeve listened like she had been trained to do, with telegrams coded parts and the human meaning layered beneath. The revelation did not make her small with anger as it might have 3 years earlier. It made her feel all the things citizens feel when they watch someone confess: pity and power and an odd softening. She let herself answer with her measured truth. "I was sold," she told him. The words were flat and all at once charged. "But I am not the ledger to be bartered." They stood then, not as accused and accuser, but as two people who had been broken into pieces by circumstance and had spent years learning to put themselves back together. Jonas reached for her hand, and she let hers rest in his, the skin of his thumb gliding over the scar on her knuckle. It was not the power grab it could have been. It was, instead, permission. There was a surrender on his part, a willingness to be seen failing and to accept whatever consequence lay ahead. There was a surrender on hers, an opening that did not erase the past, but allowed it to be acknowledged. Eli, for his part, did not stay in town much longer. He had done what he intended. He had exposed Hargreaves' conspiracy, pushed the ledger out into the daylight, and remained that curious figure who belonged more to the road than a hearth. He left things in motion and watched from the periphery like a shepherd of sorts. On a morning when the frost had not yet surrendered to sun, he stood at the edge of town and tipped his hat to them as he passed. "You two should stop pretending you'll never be brave," he told Maeve. "It's getting old." Act 4. Earned intimacy. There was a night when everything got smaller and larger at once. The town's little order had been rearranged by the ledger's truth. Hargreaves' men had retreated for a while, nursing the world's unwillingness to be exposed. The telegraph office was quiet. Maeve sat with a pot of coffee by the stove, the ebb of the day moving into an intimate dusk. Jonas had been at the meeting in the square, had spoken with the county judge and given what statements he could. He came to the telegraph that night, not with the swagger of law but with a careful economy of movement. When he entered, the smell of coffee and paper and oil wrapped around him like home. Maeve looked up as he stepped in, the light catching in the hair along her collar. He closed the door behind him, the click of the latch like a punctuation mark. "I told the judge everything," he said. "There was no drama in it, only the flat fact. I don't know the law will absolve me. I just know it should be known." Maeve set down her cup. Her hand trembled, not with fear but with the tiredness of a woman who had been kept busy with the politics of survival. "It should have been said before," she said. "It should," Jonas agreed. He sat across from her, close enough that the bowl of coffee between them seemed a kind of altar. For a long time, they said nothing. Language felt inadequate to the intensity of what they carried between them. Then Jonas reached across the table and placed his palm over hers. He did not speak. He let the silence be the thing that gave. Her pulse was audible to her. He could feel it under his hand like a small drum. It made a sound that matched his own, the two of them quietly listening to the animal and each other. He moved then as if he had rehearsed the action for years. He took her hand and drew it up to his mouth and pressed a kiss into her knuckles, a sanctifying gesture. It was both apology and permission, and a claim that was nothing like the claim he'd once made by removing her. Now it was tender and crooked and honest. The room shivered with it. Her breath caught. She watched his face as if she were cataloging the map of a landscape she might yet inhabit. He looked at her not like a man who wanted to own her, but like a man who had learned the cost of owning anything and wanted only to be allowed presence. The thing between them thickened into something palpable, like summer heat, and for the first time in years, the ledger had no more power to define them. Jonas rose then, as if a tide had lifted him, and hesitated. "Will you forgive me?" he asked. The words were weighted. They were not a plea for mercy so much as a vow. "I will be the man who breaks himself open to show you the truth." Maeve met his eyes. She had done her own unpicking of anger, of survival, of the parts of the past that still ached. Forgiveness felt like a slippery thing. It was not a map one could travel blindly. She said instead, "I will let you try." It was a cautious yes. It was a surrender tempered by choice. He closed the gap between them with the care of someone who understood what it meant to risk another's trust. Jonas's hands cupped her face, thumb resting against the place where a scar ran like a geography of a winter. His calloused fingers brushed the hollow at her throat. She pressed her palm to his chest, feeling muscle beneath worn cotton. Her hair spilled into his palm warm, scented with the faintness of smoke and the softness of soap. There was a trembling in his fingers as if the muscles were remembering gentleness as a new skill. They kissed then, finally, a long and careful thing that moved like the slow unwinding of tension. It was not the first time they'd come close, but it was the first time they gave over fully. The wall between them collapsing not with drama, but with a long, inevitable fold. The kiss had a heat that made the fire in the stove seem shy. Jonas's hands traveled like questions, mapping the line of her jaw and the place where her throat met the collarbone. She answered in kind, hands on his shoulders, then running down his back, feeling the hard places and the soft. It was a collision that had the economy of two people who had learned restraint, and now let the reserve come apart. The kiss deepened. His lips were earnest, the press of them like a vow. Her breath hitched. The room narrowed to the sound of two breaths, and the distant whisper of the telegraph. He moved with a careful hunger, his fingers threading into her hair, the heel of his hand settling at the small of her back. She rose toward him like a plant toward sun. What happened next was firelight and discovery, whispered names, and the slow, sacred unwrapping of two people who'd forgotten what it meant to be wanted. Fade to black. Dawn found them tangled together, her head on his chest, his hand in her hair. Neither had words. None were needed. The room smelled like coal and coffee and something older like mercy. There was a kind of quiet that lives on the other side of consent, a hush that is not absence but presence taken in deep measure. They lay like that for a long time, cataloging the small relief of being held without apology, of being wanted without purchase. When Maeve finally stirred, the first thing she noticed was the shirt, his Marshal shirt wrapped around her shoulders, falling soft over her knees. It had the faint scent of a man's morning, wood smoke and the green of soap. She tucked the sleeve into her fingers as one might tuck a blessing into a pocket. Jonas watched her with an expression that was at once gentle and ferociously proud. Like a man guarding a light he had nearly extinguished himself. She rose and moved with a wariness and a new ease all at once. The way she moved now was quieter, but there was a curve in her step that suggested a woman who had reclaimed something. Her body was hers to be wanted and to give if, and only if, she chose. Jonas helped her with mundane things, tying her boot, threading a needle for a loose seam, and his hands were steady, not commanding but attentive. He tucked a stray hair behind her ear, thumb grazing her cheekbone. The contact sent a small personal electric through her. They made small domestic agreements. She would not hold his secret of cowardice alone if he did not hold her past as a weapon. They would sleep with honesty like a shared blanket. By noon the telegraph hummed with regular business. In the corners of the room were small gestures of intimacy that matched the wildness of the night before. His mug chipped when she had used it, her ribbon frayed at the ends where he had fiddled with it in his sleep. There were no grand promises, only the kind of slow vows that come when two adults decide to be present. The town went on, but now when Jonas and Maeve walked past one another on Main, their hands brushed and no longer set off thunders. As winter turned, they built a life of small, consistent touches. Jonas took to standing on the porch while Maeve worked, bringing in wood at times and leaving the bigger repairs to be done in daylight. She showed him the satisfaction of tending wires, and he showed her the patience of unmade maps. They spoke of the future in terms that were unhurried. The telegraph could continue to be her kingdom, he said, if she wanted it. He could be by her side without owning her. There was a tenderness now that came with the respect of labor and the understanding that desire was not an endpoint but a companion. The Ledger story continued to weave through the town's life. Hargreave was not defeated so much as exposed. Some of his men were arrested or fled, and he, for all his acres, found himself besieged by bad press and law. It was not an end to the kind of greed that sat in the bones of men, but it was a rearrangement, a demonstration that a ledger kept in a woman's hands could be more dangerous than the might of a baron. Jonas changed too. He learned that strength had as much to do with being able to say the truth as with the ability to stand and take blows. His restraint developed the quality of a dam chosen willingly rather than one forced by fear. He became the kind of man who could be fierce in defense without being cruel in possession. Maeve, for her part, discovered that vulnerability was not a weakness but a door. The room she had kept shuttered in herself opened, not to let the wind in for its own sake, but to let company come and rest. The town mended, bearing scars, and the two who had been at the Ledger Center found in each other a kind of restoration. They were both, in the way good frontier people were, pragmatic about the work of being decent. They had discovered that real love in a place like Dry Creek didn't come like a bandit in the night. It came with chores and warm mittens, with hands at the reins and a bed made when the other was tired. It also came sometimes with heat like a furnace, for two people who had been starved of tenderness for years. On a late afternoon when the sun tracked low across the valley, Jonas and Maeve sat on the porch, the telegraph office behind them sealed well enough for winter. There was a small, desperate kind of peace in the way the town settled into its own rhythm. She leaned against him, his arm around her shoulders, and the weight of his hand was nothing if not a kindness. He had given back what he could, and had taken the consequences he had to. She had reclaimed what she needed and had allowed herself to be wanted. They had been told once that second chances were for the young. That passion was a commodity that expired with the bloom of youth. They had disproved that quietly, in the way two steady people can. They had taught each other the sharpness of acceptance and the warmth of wanting. In the slow way of towns like theirs, their story of wrongs acknowledged and of the daring to desire settled into something the town liked to admire quietly. Two people who had once been bartered and who now had one another, not as possession, but as chosen partners. Final call to action, and so their story continues where yours might begin. They were told second chances don't exist, that desire fades with age, that scars make you unlovable. They proved every word wrong. He learned that strength isn't restraint, it's knowing when to surrender. She discovered that vulnerability isn't weakness, it's the bravest intimacy. Together they found that the most profound love includes both tender respect and passionate wanting. If you're a woman who's been told your time for romance has passed, that passion is only for the young. That love should be quiet, or it isn't real welcome home. These are stories where mature women reclaim desire without shame, where attraction and respect aren't enemies, where physical chemistry grows from emotional connection. Subscribe for tales of second chances that include both heart and heat. Like this if you believe women deserve love stories that honor all of who they are. Share with every woman who needs reminding that desire doesn't expire, it deepens. Because these aren't just stories. They're permission to want fully, love bravely, and embrace every part of your passionate, powerful self.